Hello, Waswere here, back with another video, and today we're going over the pocket slot. It has changed a bunch over the past year, with God Wars Dungeon 3 bringing in 3 new PVM scriptures, and alongside them coming into the game, the pages are very common, so the upkeep cost is a lot less than previous pocket slots where scrimshaws were over $1 mil an hour, Arma Book was over $1 mil an hour, and the Grimoire was like $4 mil an hour. This video is going to cover pretty much every single pocket slot you'll ever need for PVM. Think of this as a reference tool on where to use each pocket slot and why. It's going to cover the original 6 god books, Armadyl, Guthix, Zeros, Saradomin, Bandos, and Zamrak. The 3 new God Wars Dungeon 3 scriptures, Jas, Wen, and Full. With the Bic book being a skilling one, we don't need to talk about it here. Then there's the Erethdor's Grimoire from Solak, and the various scrimshaws that you can get from ports, Vampirism for melee, Cruelty for ranged, and Elements for magic. While we mosey over to the Grand Exchange to pick up all these pocket slot items, let's talk about today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the perfect free mobile game to pair with your Runescape grinding, whether that be AFK skilling, high-level PVM, or bank standing. Raid has a ton of champions, over 600 now, with unique factions that have their own lore in the world of Teleria. If you use my link in the description below, right now you can play one of the greatest mobile games of all time. The newest clan boss just released in Raid, and it's the craziest one yet. This boss is a Hydra with 6 different heads, all with their own unique mechanics. For example, the head of Torment is downright scary, as it looks like it belongs in a death metal album. Its special True Fear makes you skip your turns and lose access to your skills. Just dreadful. The way to conquer this head is to hide by using champions that have Veil skills. On the other hand, the Head of Wrath is powerful. It gets angry, and angry quickly. It starts off by taunting your team to weaken them, so you deal less damage per hit, but its real special comes out once you hit it 15 times, called Vengeance. This triples its attack power until the end of its turn, making it very deadly. To counter this, use champions that hit high, but infrequently, in order to stop the Head of Wrath from reaching that Vengeance stage. What I like about Raid is the planning process. Before an encounter, you want to prepare your team as best you can by selecting the right champions for the job. This optimization is what I look for in games, and Raid has that. And when I want to relax, I'll just take a glance through a faction's best champions to see exactly what I want next. Oh, and if the biggest, baddest boss in the entirety of mobile games isn't enough for you, there's more. Raid's also giving away a super limited edition champion to every player in the game. Some of you may recognize him already. It's esport legend and Navi superstar Simple. Between now and January 28th, 2022, Simple's limited edition champion is available for free to both new and old players in Raid. All you have to do is log in for 7 days between now and January 28th, and he's yours. If you miss that date, you miss out forever. And he's awesome, so you definitely don't want to wait around. There's a ton happening in Raid this month. To start off, Raid is releasing a bunch of awesome new champions, along with a brand new Faction Wars crypt to one of my favorite factions, the Shadowkin. It's going to be amazing, and I can't wait for the crypt to open so I can dive in and see what it's all about. On top of that, there's a ton of New Year's events and tournaments, including a special fusion event where you can get one of Raid's newest legendary champions. There's seriously never been a better time to get started, and if you use my link in the description or scan my QR code, you'll get a free starter pack worth almost $30 to kickstart your game. We're talking a free champion, Rector Drath, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, an XP boost, and an ancient shard. So you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in-game. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. Once you're in, you can find me in-game under the name Waswere, and if you're fast, you can join my clan. Now back to your regularly scheduled PVM advice. We're going to start with the God books. These are mostly out of relevance now as they've been power crept by the new scriptures. The one exception is the Arma book, also called the Book of Law, which is still best in slot at next. The first book, the Book of Balance, is the old AoE God book. It has a 5% chance to activate, and when activated, it gives an initial hit of 90 to 150%, then 3 small hits on the main target. Then the final hit is an AoE hit of 37.5 to 62.5% ability damage. This God book was used in AFK Slayer AoE situations, such as my Crystal Shapeshifter guide, but it has been supplanted by the scripture of Wen, which is far superior. This book can still be used in AoE situations until you own the Scripture of Wen, as the pages are super cheap at under 40k each, but once you own the Scripture of Wen, it can go in the trash. The next book is the Book of War. This is a budget status Warhammer or Gothic staff. When it activates, it hits the target for 90 to 150% damage and also debuffs the target in both defense and affinity. This drastically increases your hit chance and all of those you are PvM with for the next 12 seconds. In high level combat, most teams will have someone with the status Warhammer that can do the same thing in an essence of finality, and you don't need a god book to get this effect. However, if you're an undergeared or low-level Iron Man and you have this book completed, if you're doing any sort of group content where people are splashing like Yakamaru or Beastmaster, one person on the team can wear this and boost the hit chance of everyone else, and it's worth losing a higher DPS pocket slot on one person to get the buff for everyone in the group. Again, this is a very cheap book with the pages costing less than 20k each if you're a main. The Book of Chaos is another AoE book, but it has a major problem that the 150 to 250% damage is split over all targets, meaning that if you have more than a couple targets, the Book of Balance will outperform it. There might be some niche situations where you mostly have 2 targets where this will outperform the Book of Balance in terms of AoE, but this one is kind of stuck in between being both an AoE book and a single target book, and it ends up just being bad at both. If you need AoE, you go for an AoE book, and if you need single target, you go for a single target book. The Ancient Book is probably the most useless book in this entire video. It deals poor single target damage at 120 to 200% per activation, and its only redeeming quality is that it binds the target for 4 seconds. The only problem is that if you're bossing, almost every boss is stun and bind immune, and if you're slaying, you're going to use an AoE book or a higher damaging single target book. There's a reason that I was able to buy a page for 6k for this video. Now we're moving on to the good single target god books. The first one is the Book of Wisdom, which hits the target for 165 to 275% damage, which makes it the highest single hit of all the regular god books. This makes the Book of Wisdom very popular to use as a god book until the God Wars Dungeon 3 scriptures are obtained. Its popularity is reflected in its price, where it's over 100k per page, making it still affordable to use, but not so cheap that you can basically call it free. The last god book is the Book of Law, and as mentioned earlier, it's the only god book that still sees Relevance as a best-in-slot item. It's the best single target god book as its activation deals a total of 180 to 300% damage over the 4 hits, but it comes with a major downside. The tornadoes are placed on the ground instead of on the target, so if the target moves between the 1st and 4th hit, you lose all the remaining damage. And most of the damage comes late into the ability, so you lose a lot. It's best in slot at Nex due to the fact that both Nex and the minions have pretty heavy soft caps, meaning a bunch of small hits are considerably better than one large hit, and the book helps you to one-shot the minions with greater ricochet after it has had its damage values nerfed. As a summary, they are in 5 categories. Never use the Ancient or Chaos book. Use the Book of War and group encounters when you need the accuracy. Only really one person needs to. You don't want to have the entire team using the Book of War. For AoE, use the Book of Balance, and then finally, depending on if the target moves or not, and other factors, you can use the Book of Law or the Book of Wisdom for damage. Overall, as a reminder, once you own the Elder God Wars books, all but the Book of Law at Nex gets replaced, so think of these as stepping stones rather than overall best pocket slot items. Speaking of god books, let's start going over them, starting with the Scripture of Jas. It has slightly better passive stats than the original god books at +8 style bonus and +5 prayer bonus, one higher than the original god books in each. This is the worst of the 3 scriptures right now, but it still handily outperforms all the other god books if you have good damage. The major drawback of this book is that the damage is delayed by 10 seconds. So by the time you actually get the damage dealt to your target, the kill might be over, the boss might be invulnerable, or you might not be in a DPS phase. As a whole, player buffs are better than damage hits, as you know you're going to get the damage on every hit rather than a big hit at the wrong time. Its cheap upfront price of 20 mil and page cost of 25k each makes this a very affordable gear upgrade and worth getting pretty early on a main account, even if it's not as good as the other 2 God Wars Dungeon 3 scriptures. The Scripture of Wen, on the other hand, is probably the most popular scripture out there. It has a lot going for it. It deals a large amount of single target damage, up to 420% total, and it also hits anything in the 3x3 area around it, making it a very invaluable pocket slot item. And unlike the Scripture of Jas or the Scripture of Foe, which is coming next, this god book doesn't take into consideration the amount of damage that you do. only the gear you have equipped, so it's very friendly to people who use Revo or just aren't there in terms of their high level DPS. The only potential drawback is that it's another pocket slot item that targets the ground instead of following a monster. This means that if a boss or creature is very mobile, you'll likely miss them a bunch of times, losing out on the Godbook damage. Assuming it doesn't move away, the Scripture of When will beat the Scripture of Jas most of the time in terms of single target DPS, and it will also replace the Book of Balance as your AoE pocket slot. The last scripture, the Scripture of Full, might be the most underrated item in this whole video. It's very good, and I don't think many people are talking about it. When active, it gives 20% more damage, while increasing the damage taken by 10%, almost like a mini Zerg. This is a player buff, and as I mentioned earlier, player buffs are better than activated hits because they are more consistent with the damage. The average uptime with the Scripture of Full is between 50 to 60% depending on what you're doing, and the rough math has it as almost a 10% DPS increase by using it. This is by far the single highest damage increase for a pocket slot item, at least in terms of raw damage. The only drawback is that in short encounters you aren't going to get the most out of it, as it's unlikely that your first ability gets the activation. I would suggest this as a purchase somewhere in the era after getting Greater Ricochet, but before you have the ECB, SGB, and all the multiple bills upgrades. The cost is around 500 mil as of the time of making this video. Flat out, it's the best in slot pocket slot item unless you need the Grimoire for crit synergies or hit cap issues. Did I also mention that the pages are super cheap at under 100k each? Let's move on to Scrimshaws, and there are 3 relevant ones, one for each style, that I want to talk about. The melee one is the Scrimshaw of Vampirism. It heals for 5% of damage done, up to a maximum of 200 per hit. If it's a superior Scrimshaw, then it heals 6.67% instead, but with the same max hit. I like to use this as training wheels. While I was still learning how to melee ED3, I had a Vamp Scrim on the entire time, so I could not worry about soul split flicking or other things while I was learning. Once I got comfortable with the content, I made the switch to Grimoire, which sped up my kill times considerably. Once you get used to content, try to use it without the Scrimshaw and see if you do any better. Even if it's 1 step back, your next kill might be 2 steps forward. The Vamp Scrim also sees relevance in AFK methods to provide healing while having a protection pair up, so it's mostly used for that. A good example of that would be AFKing Rathus, where you have range prey on, but you still need to heal from the damage you take from Rathus, so we use a Vamp Scrim to maintain our HP. For the Mage and Range Scrims, they are carbon copies of each other, but for the respective styles. The DPS they provide is somewhere between God books and scriptures from God Wars Dungeon 3, so if you don't own any God Wars Dungeon 3 books, you might as well pick up a couple as they last 3 to 4 hours. But like other things, once you own the God Wars 3 scriptures, you don't really need the Scrimshaws anymore. And last but certainly not least is Erethdor's Grimoire. It's by far the best in slot pocket slot for endgame users, despite it providing less raw DPS than the Scripture of Full. It has 2 special effects that are active at all times. First, it gives plus 12% critical chance. This is already about a 6 to 7% DPS increase just by virtue of critting more, but it also gets more with crit synergies, namely the Fractured Staff of Armadale, where every critical hit is another 2-hit auto, so 12% more crits is 12% more autos, which is a lot of extra damage. It also increases the maximum hit cap to 15,000, which is vital to the melee combat style, as even with T90 weapons and T80 gear, you're constantly hitting that cap with Berserk. The Grimoire is vital to both Staff of Armadale users and melee users, and it's so powerful that you're basically locked to only using the Grimoire, and that's why even with pages above 3 mil and even up to 4 mil sometimes, people will continuously add to their Grimoire to get all that extra damage. Now that we've covered all the pocket slots I wanted to in the video, let's summarize. And I think PVME has already done a great job of summarizing which pocket slot to use, so why bother recreating the wheel when it's done so well? There are 3 notes need to be kept into consideration. Depending on the boss you're doing or the DPM you're outputting, the order might flip around. For example, if I were to use the Scripture of Jas, I'm likely to out DPS the Scripture of When, because I have the gear and skill to put up 300k DPM, but others who are putting up 150k DPM would still get more out of the Scripture of When. They kind of tailor this to this, where if you only own the Scripture of When and the Scripture of Jas, you're likely in a position where the Scripture of When is going to do more damage than the Scripture of Jas. Whenever a boss is very mobile, just exclude the When book, as you're not going to get a lot out of it. And for bosses with short phase, scriptures are less important. For example, at Virago, the Grimoire is better than the Scripture of Full, despite me not doing any incendiary shot rotations with range. Just because it rarely activates on the short phase 3s, despite it on paper being much better than the Grimoire for what I'm doing. For Mage, if you have the Staff of Armadyl, you are Grimlocked. There won't be another pocket slot you use unless you're AFK or doing low effort content like normal mode Zuck. But if you're a Major that doesn't have the Staff of Armadyl yet, you'll follow the standard Full is best, followed by Grim, then Wen, then Jas. And then if you have none of those, pick up a damaged Scrimshaw. For ranged, it's a little more complicated. As mentioned earlier, for Nex, you want to use the Armadyl Godbook due to its consistently low hits. The 20% buff for Full and the crit buff from the Grimoire don't do much, as Nex has pretty strong hit caps, and the other books will help you more specifically for killing the minions. That's why they even suggest the Guthix book, which has 4 small hits, over the other god books if you don't have Armadyl. When you're doing incendiary shot rotations where every critical gives you 10% extra adrenaline for 30 seconds, criticals are way more valuable than the extra damage from Full, so you're gonna stick on the Grim. I do this at Nex Angel of Death while chinning, as the criticals are extremely important to the rotation, but if I'm doing a range entangle rotation, the criticals aren't as important there, as you're not using incendiary shot multiple times a kill, so you can get away with using the Scripture of Full. Otherwise, it follows the same order as non-Staff of Armadyl Mage above, with the Full being the best. For melee, it's very similar, except the Grimoire is the best over the Full, and that's just due to the higher hit caps, though you can get away with the Scripture of Full, as it's not the end of the world, and the DPS difference between the two isn't that major. Well, that's it. That's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel. If you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. But past that, have a good day, and I'll catch you in the next one.